So today this talk will probably be a little bit different from, as Jean has alluded to, from the normal format. There's going to be a little bit of interactivity. So at certain points in the talk I'm going to ask people from the audience to pick one or the other options. It'll sort of become clear as we get into it. But you're also the test audience, so at the end it would be great to get any feedback or about how it goes and what you thought worked or didn't. So, the museum cares for over 2.3 million collection objects or taonga. I've got an asterisk here at least because I think that we've been using 2.3 for several years and it's probably slowly increased as we've added to the collections over time. And all of these collections in taonga have important stories of their own, and often we sort of look at them in isolation, but they're actually sort of involved in a web of complex interactions and connections when you start to look into them. And two of the key components, or core components about these collections are the people and the places associated with them. So when you look at collections and all the information and metadata associated with them, we can sort of tease out these collections. Collection connections, themed in the Canterbury colours. So the idea for this talk has actually come sort of from the internet. It's an idea called the knowledge graph. So things are sort of related in this idea of triples. You've got a subject, predicate, and object, and they sort of, you can have one thing is connected to another thing by a certain means, and then you can start to build up these webs of interactions. And here is sort of a graphical example of this. So here we've got a knowledge graph looking at the portrait of Madam X, and so when you start looking at how that's connected, you can sort of see the different themes and strands associated with it. So for example, we've got the black dress of Rita Haywood. That was inspired by the Madam X portrait. And so when you click on that, you can see all these other associations with that. So this is sort of the basis for the talk that I've developed. It's a more simplified version with sort of one path or the other. And it's going to focus mostly on natural history collections, but it's going to pull into different parts of social history as well, human history. And the topic that we're going to start with is one of our iconic relics of native vegetation in Christchurch, is Ridden Bush, or Dean's Bush, from the Rangamotu. And we've got a couple of images of the bush as it is in its current state, although there's work being done to upgrade the walking paths in it at the moment. And over on the far side, a watercolour from 1851 by James Edward Fitzgerald shows the early sort of setting that the Deans settled in, with Ridden Bush in the background. So this is where the audience participation starts. Does someone want to select one of these options? So first we've got the Taylor family. In the top right corner there is William Anderson Taylor. He is a well-known and reputed early photographer in Christchurch. So the museum cares for hundreds or even thousands of his photographic collections, which were recently digitised. He was born in Scotland in 1883 and immigrated as a child in 1891 to New Zealand. And then, of course, the Deans is a story that's another Scottish immigrant story that's well known. So, does anyone want to choose one?
Taylor.
Taylor?
I know the Deans.
So, as I mentioned, Taylor has a significant collection of photographs and glass plate negatives. He was really interested in the history of early Māori and European settlement in New Zealand, so he travelled about and cycled around the South Island interviewing people, visiting places, scenic places all over the island. And he documented many natural history scenes as part of his journeys. And the connection here is he has taken many photographs of Ridden Bush. They're really quite an interesting snapshot into the past of settlement of the bush, sort of 50 or 60 years after the Deans originally settled there. And then you can see the house in all its glory just from across the Avon River in the early days. But as part of his travels, we can sort of see that he did get around, because this is a photograph from Otago, and this was all in sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s, so it was, you know, a much harder time to get around. So this was from in Otago in the Blue Range Mountains, a waterfall at Whiskey Valley Stream. And yeah, so the output of his work is kept in the museum, and we've got about 16 photo albums and over 9,000 objects associated with them. So it's a really great snapshot into the history of Canterbury and wider. And the connection there is Brickenbush plays host to a range of different animals. With my bug background, I've picked a couple of selections. So one, we've got this longhorn beetle, Hybelaceus. Longhorn beetles are distinguished by their antennae. So usually their antennae will be more than half the length of the body. And then the other insect we have is a lichen moth, Declina rocosa. Lichen moths are known for their camouflage patterns. So their wing patterns are modelled, and they'll often camouflage into trees and lichen and other things. So which one do we want to go through this time? Moth or beetle?
Sorry.
Moth.
Which one? I was going to go moth. What's moth?
We've gone the moth. And so for the moth story, we've got a significant early moth collector, Richard Faraday. Something I actually only just recently found out about is I thought that he was a collector on his own accord, but it was actually him and his wife, Mary Ann Parker Faraday, that went around collecting insects and moths in his time. So he was active in the late 1800s through the sort of 1880s, 1870s and through the 1890s. His wife actually donated a large collection of foreign moths and butterflies to the museum, which we still hold. And here's an example of one of the moths that they collected. It's called a ghost moth, Wisonia cervinata. And as you can see from the scale, it's got a decent sort of wingspan, about 2.5 to 3 centimetres wide. Richard was actually a barrister and solicitor by training, but he was also a very keen moth researcher. So he did a lot of work on the early New Zealand moth fauna. He would send some of his specimens to another well-known moth researcher in England, Edwin Merrick. So a lot of the specimens he collected actually went there for the research to happen on them. One of the techniques that Faraday and early moth people used was called sugaring. Sugaring is a combination of ripe fruit, molasses and spirit, all mixed up into a slurry. You'd paint it on a tree, and the moths would be attracted to it, and then you'd come back with a candle light at night at the time, because of course you didn't have a head torch, and you'd be able to collect the moths off the tree. But another important thing that Richard was associated with was the early Canterbury Art Society establishment. So he was very active in setting up the art scene. And here we've got a couple of works by Richard. So we've got a watercolour of the Rakai Gorge and another watercolour of Park Terrace, which of course is along Hagley Park, just up over here. Which is the next connection. So the two places. So we've got Park Terrace, one of the well-known terraces in Christchurch from the early days. Here is a photograph of the across the Avon at the Armagh Street Park Terrace intersection just up here. And then the other option is the Rakai Gorge. Here is a slide showing some people in the foreground with the gorge in the middle and Mount Hutt and the Hutt Range in the background. So which way do we want to go?
The gorge, please.
The gorge. Thank you. A great choice. Rakai Gorge is a pretty significant site in Canterbury. And it's a landmark that's been known and associated for a long period of time. In the early days, you couldn't actually get across the gorge. So how would you do that? Well, you'd do it by a ferry or boat. So here we've got a slide showing the ferry and ferryman hut. This was the means to get across the river at that stage up until about 1893 when an iron bridge was first constructed there. Of course, you can see a bridge in the background of this photograph, so this was after that, but the ferry would have been used periodically when it was required. The last ferryman recorded to do the crossings at the Rakai Gorge was Dan Driver, which is a relatively fitting name for a ferry person. And then, of course, we've got the historic bridge at Rakai Gorge, which we can see in the middle top of this slide. But the other thing about Rakai Gorge is that it's a significant geological area. There's a lot of interesting geology there, as well as biological interactions. So one of the common occurrences on the far right, we'll see concretions. So these look like they're moulded or shaped worked things. These are actually natural concretions of sediment that form in the silts around Rakai Gorge. So these sort of got a nucleus which forms, and they'll slowly grow out and then eroded out of the riverbed as it's cut into. And you can see the random variety of shapes in the slide below. You can get all sorts of different unique forms and patterns. One of the biological stories is this beetle here. This is called a click beetle. There's a couple of reasons why it's called a click beetle. One, it makes a sound that clicks, but the mechanism behind that, it's like a spring and latch. So essentially, in the middle part of the beetle, the thorax and the abdomen, it locks in part of its body and it'll pop and then it goes flying in the air. There's two reasons for that. One is to avoid things trying to catch it, a random sort of movement, but also when it's upside down and it can't get up, that's the way it flips it back out on the right side. Very clever. Another thing you'd think associated with rivers is bird and bird life. So here we've got an example of some ribel eggs. So ribels are a type of bird, which their name sort of is indicative of. They've got a crooked beak at the end, which they use to get around the cobbles of rounded river stones. The eggs also have a pretty unique biological mechanism. They are really good at camouflaging. So they've got this little speckling, which makes them look like little river cobbles. And what this means is that they're very hard to see when you're walking along, another sort of form of camouflage. And the last thing to highlight here is this historic photograph of a Rakai Gorge scene. It's hard to make out. There is a person sitting here precariously on this rock, as noted on the edge of the slide. So this image is sort of an important snapshot into the past, looking at what the Rakai Gorge would have looked like. And it's associated with an Edward Seeley, who was a pioneer photographer like Taylor, and a compatriot of the first museum director, Julius von Haast, which is our next connection. So we've got Edward Percy Seeley, who I just mentioned, was a pioneering early photographer, and of course most people in this room should know Julius von Haast. So which direction do we want to take this one?
We'll go Seeley, we don't know as much about them.
Fantastic. Yes, so Seeley is actually a really important part of Haast's story. Of course, we know Haast was the provincial geologist. He went around the South Island documenting all of the geology of the land. But Seeley accompanied him often on these trips and is attributed for taking photographs of some of these trips and these scenes where they went. So up here is the Haupapa Tasman Glacier. This photograph was probably taken from a point that the glacier has receded. That ice is probably further up the valley now, because of course over 100 years ago the glaciers were further down and they've slowly moved back. And here's another scene. This is at Mount Sefton, which is just south of Aoraki Mount Cook, sort of highlighting that they travelled quite far in those early days to survey these scenes. And then going further up the range, we've got the Otira Gorge Bridge, probably a much more sketchy drive or horse and cart down that than today. This is another photograph that Seeley took, sort of highlighting the scenes of the past. And in the top middle there, you'll see that a set of 4 photographs. A lot of these photographs that Seeley took were actually prepared onto these canvas canvases and then placed in the early Mountford Gallery, the very first time the museum was opened, sort of documenting the history for the people coming in. Seeley was also a natural history enthusiast, so we've got a few specimens by him. Here is a brown tealeg that he collected from Otago. Interestingly though, Seeley ended up in South Canterbury, and that's where he finished his life. So most of his natural history collection actually is in the South Canterbury Museum, where we've got a lot of his photographic collection. But there is a bit of a question here, is how did Seeley in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, 1860s even, take these photographs? Because back in that time, the technology wasn't developed into a little portable camera. Well, as we can see on the newspaper clip on the far side there, his camera weighed 15 pounds, and his dry plates, which we used to develop the photographs, 20 pounds. So this was a dead weight that he had to carry into places of 35 pounds, which didn't even account for food, tent, clothes. So it's a massive effort. So it's about 15 kgs, which was the equivalent of 10 DSLR cameras or 92 iPhones that he was carrying. The other thing that he had to carry was a tent, specifically for developing the photographs in the field, because they couldn't just come back and do it in the lab. So all of these photographs were taken and developed in the field, which is a truly impressive feat. Yeah, I had a little bit of fun with the animation. Which brings us to the last connection on this, which is the Seeley Range and the Seeley Tarn. So because of Seeley's significant role in Christchurch and Canterbury, there are a couple of places named for him, and these are two of them. So here we've got some things associated with the Seeley Tarns. On the far right, we've got a slide from the Kennedy collection. So the Kennedy collection is a significant collection of over 2,000 alpine photographs, predominantly, but some other topics as well. This was taken before 1950, because that's around the end date of the Kennedy collection. So this place had been accessed for many years over time. And here we've got some of the fun little critters. Of course, there'll be critters that you'd find if you were there. So these are all things that have been collected from that area. So in the bottom middle here, we've got a seed bug, a type of true bug. These bugs have this piercing sucking mouth part that they'll stick their tongue into and suck out plant juices. Up top, we've got an Oroprambus, which is a grass moth. They're also called a snout moth. The photo doesn't show it, but they've got a long snoot at the front of their heads. And they've also got quite interesting coloration on their wings. And then the last insect that we're looking at here is a fly, a Theridiidae, or stiletto fly. They're named a stiletto fly because when they're up on their legs, they sort of, on the side, form the shape of a stiletto. So, that's one part of the talk, and given that this is a talk that I've only written, I hadn't timed, so I've set it up as essentially 9 or 10 different talks, or I'm not sure how many we can do, but we're going to go back to the start and potentially take a different path. So we can carry on down the Taylor path and go a different way, or we can go down the Dean's section. Down the Dean's, it definitely will be different. So of course we know the Dean story, it's very well documented, so I won't cover it in depth, but I will pull out a few interesting tidbits about this, about the family. So here we've got one of the early photographs of the cottage, which is obviously a very simple affair when they settled, and the cottage is still there in today. And the Deans are a big reason why we still have brick and wood preserved in perpetuity. The top middle photograph is of the Dean's family, about 1890. So you've got John Dean's passed by then, but you've got Jane Dean's in the middle, and then the rest of the family growing up over time. But the really interesting thing, as part of the research for this talk that I came across, was this map. This is a map of the Riccarton estate, and the thing I really wanted to highlight is this part here, the attempted murder site. So if we look over onto the right, it's sort of zoomed in on the map, there's a spot that says opponent, position of encounter Deans, about 2 yards apart. What this is in reference to is a story of that John Deans one day was going out to get some wood on a chilly morning with lots of layers on to build a railing for part of the house. So he went out and he was walking along and he came across this stranger, this person he'd never seen before. And so they sort of had a bit of a confrontation and a struggle. It turns out the stranger had just stolen a bunch of jewels and hidden them in the bush in a tree stump. So what happened from there is the guy pulled a gun and a couple of shots and shot John Deans. Of course, John also had a gun in case dogs were attacking stock. It didn't end in tragedy insofar as that John survived. There was sort of writings in some of the papers saying the extra layers he had on helped protect him, so it mustn't have been a very powerful gun. But it's sort of just one of those little quirky stories that you can come across when you start teasing out these connections. The other thing to note up in the top right corner is that a provincial council, provincial chambers building and the Avon River. So the Avon River actually is named by the Deans. It's a river in Scotland. A lot of people thought that it's an English river. There's 5 Avon rivers in England and a few in Scotland, but actually it was the Deans that drove that. And in Celtic, Avon actually means river. So Avon River is river. And also Riccarton is named for the place that the Deans brothers grew up in, Ayrshire in Scotland. So that Riccarton is also a Scottish root. But the Avon River is the connection for this one. So we've got 2 options. We've got a white heron, a kotuku, and a galaxid, which is a type of inanga or whitebait. So the kotuku story is a little bit of a sad one, as is the case for most museum specimens. This animal met an unfortunate fate. It would fly over from the west coast, where it breeds, and it was the early 1920s and the 1930s, and visit the Avon River, but also the Christchurch Club. And the staff there would feed fish to this bird. So every year it would come over and get a nice feed from the staff. Unfortunately, one day it wandered too far, sniffing out some fish into a freezer unit. And the door got locked for several days, which was very sad for the club. So in honour of the bird, they got a taxidermy and placed it in the card room to honour the memory of this heron. And then the galaxid was a specimen of a fish that was collected by a C.S. Woods, or a Cecil Woods, who the museum has a significant collection from, who was very active in the 1960s. So which way do we want to go? Galaxis. So Cecil Woods, who is still around today, he lives in Dunedin, is a prominent fish collector, and went all over New Zealand, mainly the South Island, and we've got over 1,000 fish specimens that he collected. And he worked in the 1960s and was produced one of these books on freshwater and fish, Native and Introduced. So he's got a decent backing of literature and research behind him. Now the reason that galaxids are called that is for galaxy. So when you look at the head of one of these specimens, you can see how it's sort of mottled like stars. It makes the appearance of a galaxy. And these photos are sort of highlighting that the collections are always alive and active. So a researcher just last year came to look at some of these specimens that were collected from some strange places, not recorded based on the species that they were, and found some interesting results associated with that. He also collected other sorts of fish. So here we've got an upland bully from a different site, and then a kana or a lamprey. So the lamprey is quite an interesting animal. They're sort of a parasitic fish that lives in freshwater and the ocean. The adults will swim up a stream and lay their eggs. The eggs will hatch out, and as juveniles they'll feed on algae for several years, and once they've grown up big enough they'll go out to sea. And they use you can sort of see down the bottom there, they've got sharp latching teeth which they'll grab onto sharks or other big fish and use them to take them for a ride around the oceans. And eventually, once they become sexually mature, they'll come back to freshwater streams, swim up, and the cycle will start again. The other thing to highlight about this collection, it's a really good snapshot in time showing where native fish predominantly were found, because over time, as there's been change in rivers and environments, we've lost some population. So these are really important snapshots to let us know what was where and when. And sort of associated with what was where when, these are a couple of the connection between this is a couple of other sites that Cecil Wood had collected fish from. So we've got a couple of locations here. Here we've got a fantastic photograph of a horse and cart on Lake Wairea, Lake Forsyth, Wairea, Banks Peninsula. There's a few names associated with this slide on our Vernon database. It was Brilby, Barker and Ware. Brilby was the driver and assumed the Barker is probably one of the Barker family and unsure about Ware. And the other place where Woods had collected specimens was the Waiawhawha River, which is one of the longer rivers in New Zealand, 147 kilometres. So, which way are we going now?
Oh, yeah.
Go down the Waiawhawha. Let's go. There's a cool story down this path we'll hopefully come to. So, much like the Rakaia Gorge, the Waiawhawha River is a significant site in Canterbury. It has a rich history, including construction of bridges and landmarks. So, the slide in the top middle here is the bridge, the Waiawhawha Bridge over the Hammer Road, which was opened in about 1887. This is not the first bridge, however. The first bridge was blown down in 1874 by a raging nor'west gale. Yeah. And here we've got a photo, watercolour by an artist who the museum has several works of, Cranley Barden. So this is a picture of the watercolour of the Waiawhawha River, which shows the sort of parts of it, the braiding and winding nature of the river. And again, as it's a river, it plays host to all sorts of different animals and plants. And the ones we're going to look at here are a couple of shag specimens. So we've got a pied shag specimen that was collected from the river. And because the river has got such a diverse area and habitat, they'll nest and lay eggs. So these are some eggs that were collected from the river as well. And then the last story to sort of highlight on this one is on the far side. We've got the Upukororo grayling. Grayling is an extinct species of New Zealand fish, another one of those sad stories. Unfortunately, it was sort of driven to extinction by introduced exotics and name change over time. But it resembles somewhat a salmon, but it's not actually related to salmon that closely. So, the next connection is some animals of the Waiawhawha River. So we've got grayling, which we just talked about, or black-fronted terns, which are, these eggs were collected by Robert A. Feller, who was a former director of the museum and an avid bird researcher. So, which way do we want to go on this? Tern. So, so Feller was a significant ornithologist through the sort of the 1930s to the 1950s. And this is evidenced by some of his scholarship. So up the top here we can see a field guide to the birds of New Zealand, where Feller is one of the authors. And as you can see, it's a pretty sizable volume. So he'd done a lot of work in documenting and working on bird biology. Some of his collections are from a very far afield. So he went all over, sort of travelling on ships into the subantarctic oceans, looking for birds on islands. And as you can see from the portrait, he was certainly a keen ornithologist with the tools of the trade in his hand, the pair of binoculars, always on the lookout for birds. In the top right is a specimen that we don't actually know the provenance of, but we do have a tag that Feller was the person who identified this as a Salvin's albatross. And going back to the subantarctic thing, Fowler also travelled to many islands. So these red-billed gull eggs were collected from Rose Island in the Auckland Islands, which is a few hundred kilometres south of New Zealand in the 1940s. And as is often the case with those associated with the museum, is the drawer of the mower. So Fowler was also interested in mower, and as part of the museum's history, Fowler's collected this specimen here, this mower pelvis, from Pyramid Valley, which is obviously one of the well-known fossil sites in New Zealand. But the connection here is the subantarctic. Yeah. So Fowler participated in many of these trips down to the subantarctics to do research. But the other great thing about Fowler was he was a keen photographer. So we've got a lot of his collections, photograph collection that he made on these trips. So up the top left here, we've got a couple of gentlemen, an R. Carrick and Liam Hines, at the nest of an albatross. They'll be measuring or doing some sort of research on the albatross there. This is an example of great collection practice. We've got the context of where it was collected and what's happening there with the date. Sometimes we'll have a lot of these other photographs that don't have any information, so these sorts of things are real gold. In the bottom middle, this is bird preparation in action. So after collecting some of these specimens, they would be preparing them on the ship. So this is a little lab that was set up, and you can see them working on sort of pulling apart wings and skinning some of them and preparing them to turn into specimens. Many of these specimens are now in the museum collection. And then we've got a great photograph of the SY Discovery crew. So this was a trip in the 1930 to 1931 region. Fowler is the man on the third from the right with the white hat on. As you can see, they're rugged up absolutely, because going down into those waters, it wouldn't be balmy tropical climate. It would be a very cold and windy and wet. So it required a big crew to be able to deliver these these trips. And we have got through to the end again, so let's go for another run. Which way are we going this time?
Back to Taylor's.
Back to Taylor. And we've had this story, so we'll go to the insects. Did we want to do the beetle or carry on down the moth path and split off? Do the beetle. So, a contemporary of Faraday, who was the moth collector, was Charles Marcus Wakefield. And the beetle that we just saw was collected by him in October 1873 from Rickman Bush. Up top are another couple of specimens that were collected by Wakefield. You can see in the top middle there's a printed label there with the words Wakefield, and above that the species identity of the beetle that he collected, Aragus aureus, which is a carabid beetle, a type of ground beetle. So Wakefield was actually a surveyor by training, as was the case with a lot of these early entomologists. They had a day job and then insects were a passion. He immigrated from England in 1854, so he travelled out, and with this beetle interest he worked quite actively writing papers on the beetle fauna of New Zealand as part of the Philosophical Society. A sad story is he made a collection of insects, which he intended to take back to England to donate to the Natural History Museum or one of the significant museums at the time. And this was on board the Blue Jacket. But a lot in 1869, unfortunately, the ship caught fire and sunk. So he'd lost his hundreds of specimens along with everyone else's cargo. So when he returned to New Zealand, he made a new collection, and actually most of that is in Canterbury Museum. But Wakefield travelled back and forth to England and New Zealand quite often, and part of his legacy is that he was a key in acquiring foreign collections of insects from England, predominantly beetles, as that's where his interest lay. Which is where another really interesting connection is made. Does anyone know the Jack Alfred Russel Wallace?
Yes. Can you give it that one?
Yes, that's dead right. So him and Darwin come up with the idea of evolution at the same time. Now, the really interesting thing, driven actually by my colleague at the back, Morgan, is that we've done some sleuthing and found that the museum has some Wallace beetles in the collection. We're the only collection in New Zealand that has these beetles. The other cool thing is some of these beetles are from his personal collection, so he used these beetles to help develop his idea of evolution. And we've got about 30 or so beetles in our collection, which is a really cool connection. And it's related, we think, that Wakefield, when he was acquiring these specimens in England, was able to purchase some of these Wallace specimens somehow. We haven't found a smoking gun letter or receipt, but based on the interest, we've done some inference, and hopefully, we're going to be able to get this story out a bit further. And so the connection from the last slide is, as part of Charles Marcus Wakefield's career as a surveyor, he travelled around. And a couple of places that he travelled around to, he collected specimens from, or many places, and a couple we're going to profile here are Temuka and Hokitika. So the first one is a Taylor image. So we talked about William Taylor early on. So this is a photograph that he's taken of some of the early automobile history of New Zealand. And the other one is a photograph from Asylum Hill of Hokitika on the west coast. Again, this was a slide from the Kennedy collection, the Alpine collection that I mentioned before. So, which way do we want to go now?
Asylum Hill, please. My brother lives there.
Oh, fantastic. A connection inside of a connection. So Hokitika is a really interesting place. It's one of the well-known South Island West Coast localities. It's got an interesting geological history, being just on the side of the Southern Alps, and a very scenic area, which can be profiled from some of these images. So here we've got a photo of the early Hokitika from the railway bridge. And then in the one beside it, we've got a photo of the Hokitika River, which is a significant river which pays home to lots of different geology, including Poanama. The last slide is sort of a plug for the West Coast. I think there's a perception that the West Coast is always raining, but this slide is a bit of an indication that that's not always the case, and it's hard to beat the West Coast on a good day. A couple of significant bird specimens were also collected from Hokitika in the collection. So here we've got New Zealand bittern. This is an endangered wetland bird. Any record of these birds is really important because it helps us know where they were. We've only got 1,000 or so birds in the wild, and that population is decreasing. So anytime we can sort of look at where they were and figure out how to look after their habitat, that's really important. Sort of highlighting the value of collections. And another sad New Zealand bird story is the native thrush pio-pio. So this specimen was collected from Hokitika. The sad thing about the extinction of this bird is apparently, for those who heard it, said it was one of the New Zealand native bird with one of the most beautiful songs in the forest, which is unfortunately not recorded as they've gone extinct before we could do that. The setting coach, another relatively well-known and notable collection item that's held in the museum. Of course, it's known as the Cobb and Co coach. It's the Cobb and Co coach, but it's known as the Seddon coach for the fact that former Prime Minister Richard Seddon used to travel on this coach between his home in Kumara on the west coast to Springfield on the east coast. So the connection to Hokitika here is actually the last trip that it took as a coach was from Upper Riccarton, carrying a party to Hokitika for a picnic and back, returning back to Christchurch.
Not the same day.
Not the same day. And the last thing to highlight is coming back to the geology. We've got a couple of really important specimens. So these specimens were collected by two prominent geologists associated with the museum. So we've got a hornblende schist, which was collected by Anne de Bodie, and we've got a quartz mica schist that was collected by Margaret Bradshaw, which are our next connections. So Anne de Bodie was an amateur rock and fossil collector. She donated over 700 specimens to the collection. This is a beautiful piece of bowenite which is in the Ponamu group of rocks. I was unable to locate a picture of her which I would have placed on this, so we've replaced it with one of her wonderful specimens. She also volunteered in the museum collection. And some of that work was with Margaret Bradshaw, who was an important New Zealand and Antarctic geologist who worked at the museum for many decades. She's well known for being one of the first women to run field trips to Antarctica in the sort of the 70s, 60s, 70s, maybe later. I need to check that. But both her and Anne worked on the collections in the museum and have left a significant legacy there. So which way do we want to go on this one? Antarctic. So if you're a geologist, it's a pretty active sort of profession and you're going to need some tools of the trade. So here we've got Margaret's hammer, sledgehammer and geological chisel. These would have been whacked and smacked into rocks, thousands and thousands of rocks to pull out samples and produce samples that have come back to the collection. So these tools have gone all over New Zealand and Antarctica to do this work. And speaking of specimens, I've pulled out a few to highlight some of her work in Antarctica. So here we've got some sandstones in the middle. It's part of the K221 field trip, which was the field trip that Margaret first led. They were in the rose quartz specimen with jasper fasts. They were collected from the Cook Mountains in Antarctica. Another collection specimen from a different expedition collected by Margaret was this fossil plant of a Glossopteris. Margaret's daughter and my colleague Julia Bradshaw, who you've probably heard from before, she mentioned to me that Margaret's favourite and most iconic memories of Antarctica was collecting these fossils. So this is a plant fossil from Antarctica. There's no plants in Antarctica now, but millions of years ago it was a tropical rainforest. And these are sort of the evidence to show that that is what Antarctica was like. It was a completely different place. And a neat little tidbit. And then we've got this little handmade flag by Margaret in the collection. This highlights that K221 expedition and it actually sort of focuses on some of the geology of an area that they were looking at, the Devonian Beacon supergroup, which is known for its rich fish fossil history, hence the fish-like blue creature in the middle of the flag. Yes, and so this was in the 91 and 92.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Just another connection. My brother who lives in Hokitika also went to Antarctica in the 1960s.
Connections never even do that, that's great. And carrying on the theme of rocks, we pulled out some even more interesting geology from Antarctica. So the first thing we're going to look at is that top right-hand corner, R.F. Scott. Is that a familiar name? Yes, so Robert Falcon Scott was one of the heroic era Antarctic explorers. The story is very well known. The story of this rock is that he gave it to a William Wanstall at Littleton Port before he took off on an expedition or a voyage to Antarctica. That was the provenance we were given, which was sort of a bit spurious. What sort of connected it up was the fact that Wanstall was actually a grand wizard of the Freemasons, and Scott was a Freemason also, so it is likely that there's a connection between them that plugs this rock to Wanstall.
Is that granite?
Yes.
Because my brother, he was supposed to give us some specimens. He told us you could always get Antarctic granite because it wasn't smooth, it was always, the crystals were quite irregular and rough.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is a specimen of granite. There was a couple of other specimens that Scott gave as well. Yes, so that's that. The other really cool thing is this thing here. This is a volcanic glass bomb. What is that? Well, essentially it's the eruption from a volcano in Antarctica of magma that cooled so fast that it didn't actually have time to form into a rock. So it's essentially just silica glass that's spun out. It's quite fragile and delicate. It's around about this size. It's just one of those really crazy, neat, cool things, just from the way that it is. But also highlighting that there's just quite a wide variety of geology across Antarctica. So we've got some mica rocks, and olivine basalt, and an orbicular rock. And sort of highlighting the landscape, you can see why there's a lot of geology happening in Antarctica. It's ice and rock, and so we can see here from the Mount Hope summit, one of the Antarctic slides, showing the landscape. And the last thing I wanted to profile is this. This thing beside it is the Derrick Peak meteorite, which is a relatively significant collection. Now, there's a thing about meteorites where there's two places that you're going to find meteorites a lot in the world: the desert and Antarctica, or the Arctic. And why is that? Well, for the Antarctic, it's the white contrast against the rock, but also the glaciers, as they move, rocks come up the side. So if you find the edge of a glacier, you could find a bunch of meteorites that have landed over time and been pulled up. So it was in the 1960s, a team of Japanese researchers found the first meteorite in Antarctica, and then they found the next one a few hours later, and then after about a couple of days they had hundreds of meteorites, just because of the fact that they were on a glacier reach and they found it. So this is sort of highlighting it's a really important hotspot for meteorites, and we've got some in the collection. And then of course deserts, again, they're sort of a similar premise that's quite contrasting against the sandy backgrounds. How are we going for time?
Probably back.
Shall we go back to the start? We've got another run. Alright, which way are we going now?
You choose.
Okay, we'll go, let's see, can I remember which way? Right, we're going to Great. This is a really quite a quirky little story of a Grayling specimen. So that specimen over on the far right is in the museum collection. It was presented to the museum by Mr. James Goodman of the Waiawara Ferry. So actually, James Goodman was a head clerk to R.D. Thomas, who was a barrister in Christchurch. He was also known, Goodman was also known as a specialist calligrapher, well known for his creating illuminating addresses. I am not exactly sure what they are yet. I need to do a bit more research into them. But that's a bit of background about him. The really interesting thing is the story of how this grayling got to the museum. So the story goes that Goodman was at the ferry at Uwha River, and he came across this harrier that was sort of plucking fish that had this grayling. And as it's written quite eloquently here, this is how Goodman described it. The bird of prey came by so unnatural a dinner is that he had dishonestly, maliciously, violently robbed some poor offending shag of a wholesome meal. So when we that, essentially that's what happened. So what Goodman did is he brought it into the museum, where museum curator Captain Frederick Wilson Hutton received it, and he identified this as the native grayling, as Goodman didn't know what it was. So the grayling, as I mentioned earlier, were found all throughout New Zealand rivers and have been driven to extinction by a range of factors. And so now we're sort of highlighting Hutton. Hutton was a significant, he was one of the, I think, the second or third director of the museum. He served as in an acting phase and then as a permanent director. But his history started from immigrating to Auckland, where he served as an honorary curator at the Auckland War Memorial Museum, helping pull the collections there into order. He then moved to Dunedin, where he was an honorary curator, director, and then become director of the museum, as well as the provincial geologist, before moving to Canterbury in 1880, which is where some of these stories come into play. And he became a biology professor at Canterbury College, and then he took over as museum director in 1893. He was the curator and director of the museum until he passed away on a ship travelling back from England in 1905, where he had a burial at sea. Hutton was a polymath, so he was interested in everything, including Moa, another director into Moa. But here we've got a fly story. So this is a bat-winged fly, Ixial singularis. The interesting thing about this is it was collected by Professor Arnold Wall, who was a botany professor at the time at Canterbury. It was collected from Milford Sound in the early 1900s, and then passed to Hutton. And so what Hutton did essentially was describe the species as new. It's quite an iconic species. It's got these enlarged dark wings, which are a feature associated with its habitat, which is alpine environments. Because alpine environments are cold, its big dark wings soak up heat, allowing it to be quite active and living. So it was sort of assumed that this was quite a rare species, it wasn't seen much, but then an entomologist, Brian Patrick, did a survey in the 90s, travelled all around and actually found that when you look in the right places, you can find these flies. The next critter we're going to look at is the giant weta. So this is potentially the extinct species of Canterbury giant weta. We can't be certain because that specimen is not a full adult. It's a sub-adult female. We know it's a female by the long ovipositor at the back of its body. And we know this is a Hutton specimen based on the handwriting up the top, so that's quite iconic of Hutton's hand. We've tried some DNA research to see if we can figure out if it's related to other weta, but that wasn't successful. So we haven't been able to figure out exactly if it is a new species. But the fun anecdote about this specimen is that Captain Hutton was riding up his horse called Captain on Mount Captain. So this is a Captain story. Captain Hutton on the horse Captain up Mount Captain, finding this weta. Here we've got another relic of native bush that has somehow survived seeing time of land change, Lion's Bush or Arafetala bush. So this patch of forest was farmed on the Arafetala farm, which was farmed by William Hornbrook. His brother, Major Alfred Hornbrook, set up Mount Pleasant and was an early pastoralist there. He applied for squatters' rights here and sent his brother to the farm when this was accepted. Now the bush has survived significant fire in 1863 and a massive nor'west windstorm in the 1970s. Luckily in the 70s after this event there were a couple of forest ecologists that come along and preserved the bush in perpetuity. This was Fraser Ross and Colin Burrows. They set up a management plan, and over the last 50 years it has just got to the point where in the last year it's been covenanted as a significant natural area in perpetuity. A lot of the work is dedicated to Fraser Ross, who is now 92 years old, who propagated seeds and really put a lot of effort into it. And from the bush, we've got a couple of interesting critters, of course, insect-based. So we've got a parakeet beetle on the far right side, and potentially unstriped species. Parakeet beetles are really good bio-indicators to tell how healthy an ecosystem is. The other thing you'll notice is they've got big chompy jaws, so the role that they play is eating things. They'll go around and eat pests and other insects with them. And then in the bottom here we've got this interesting beetle which is called an ironclad beetle. This is a sort of a cryptic camouflagey beetle. What it does is it secretes like sort of a glue substance on its back, and then bits of twigs and rocks and debris will glue to it, and then it sits on a tree, sort of camouflage. They're quite iconic. They've got a gnarly sort of pattern and texture to their bodies. So the connection from there is Brian John Marples, who was a collector and professor of biology at Otago University, for which the museum holds a significant amount of his collections. He collected specimens from bush, or Charles Oban Torles. He's another significant name in New Zealand history and New Zealand geology. He was the first person to document this bush when he was travelling around as part of the survey work. So which way do we want to go on that? Tories. Yes, so getting back to Tories, he was one of the early immigrants in New Zealand that was fundamental in going around surveying the land and drawing it all up. And as I said, in 1849, about a year after he arrived on his trips, he wrote about Arawhenua or Lion's Bush, calling it Horowhenua rather than Arawhenua. And he noted it as a 500-acre woodlot, so 200 hectares down to about 5 hectares today. Torlees is a well-known name in early Christchurch settlement. We've got a couple, so we've got his mother here, Catherine Torlees, who was the sister of another well-known Christchurch man and the sort of early colonist Edward Gibbon Wakefield. So that she's depicted on the top left. And in the far right is his brother, Reverend Henry Torlees. He was a minister and schoolmaster at O'Kane's Bay. So the other thing here is there's a lot, these connections are quite rich when you start looking into them.
Torlees was the first settler in Rangiora.
Yes, right, so he was part of starting the settlement at Rangiora, yeah, so there you go. Never-ending connections. One of the big legacies that Charles left was actually a whole range of mountains were named after him. So here we've got the slide in the middle, you've got Mount Torlees from Castle Hill District in 1939, so a big range of mountains were named for him. He was the first immigrant to climb up the mountains in 1849. And another honorific associated with the geological specimens is his contribution was so significant they named a whole class of rocks after Torlees. So here we've got some red slate collected from the Upper Ashburton River, and then we've got some low-bearing Torlees sandstone from the Water River. That one in the bottom right is collected by Mark Bradshaw. You can see how the mythology has changed over time. So of course the connection is the Torlees Range. I had a bit of fun with this story. So these are a few specimens just plucked out of the collection. So up the top here, Titahia, is a type of tube fossil collected from there. So essentially what that is, it's a trace fossil. It's not actually the animal that's fossilised, but the animal would have made a little tunnel or trail in the geology, and that has fossilised over time. So we know based on the structure of these tunnels that it's this type of fossil. And then again we've got more Torlees sandstone, another beautiful example of a rock. And then on the little critter front, we've got a few different examples. Up the top right, we've got a Pimlea butterfly. So Pimlea is a type of sort of mat-forming plant. This is a Notaria species. It's a beautiful orangey brown colour, which you'll find flying in the sort of spring summer months. To its bottom left, we've got a soldier fly, Zelandovirus. In New Zealand, we've got hundreds of species. Soldier flies are named for sort of the pattern on their thorax and abdomen. This one doesn't display it. Some of them look like they've got badges, as like the badges of a soldier, hence the name soldier fly. Down the bottom here, we've got a ground beetle, which is just another example of the diversity that you can have. And up here, we've got a grasshopper that bounced in on the screen. So this is a Zygea species. Only last year, there were several different types of grasshopper. Researchers have come in and said they're all one type. So if you ever see a grasshopper like this with little short antennae forms, that'll be this. So I think with that, we'll go through the summary slide for now. So this only sort of scratches the surface of the sorts of connections that exist in our collection. I've estimated very crudely that there's probably less than 0.03% of our entire collection and connection. These connections highlight how important it is, the information associated with Tonga are and how we can use these to highlight great relationships that they have. And it's the museum's role to bring these stories to life. We've got all this amazing source material and a great opportunity to really highlight these. And without highly skilled, dedicated, and brilliant staff to bring with excellent collection management, so it's sort of the inventory project and all the stuff that we're doing, we can't really tell these stories. Did you notice the frame connection?
Yes.
Yes, so the frame is from the Potts portraits, which the museum also holds. So the Potts could have been chucked in somewhere as another connection. There's a lot of stories associated with them. So I sort of tried to play something and pulled it all together, and this is an example of another connection.
Who's the artist? Or don't you know?
Good question. Need to check that out. Phones are new to the way. Yes, so with that, thank you for listening.
Wow.